Welcome to the City Club of Portland's Friday Forum. I'm Leslie Johnson, a member of City Club's Board of Governors. For over 100 years, City Club of Portland is where civic-minded people come together to make Portland and Oregon a better place for everyone to live, work, and explore. We're gathered at the Sentinel Hotel, along with all of you listening on OPB or viewing on OpenSignal or YouTube. The generous support of City Club's corporate and media partners enables us to put on the state's best civic programs week after week. Our media partner is Oregon Business Magazine, and our current Friday Forum sponsors are Family Care and Northwest Natural. Let's express our appreciation to the sponsors. I also want to acknowledge our program partner for today's Friday Forum at the World Affairs Council. Thank you very much. On to our program. In May, the FCC voted to roll back policies in favor of voluntary net neutrality. Today, our speakers will explore the potential impacts of these major changes, as well as Portland's historical role on the issue of net neutrality. David Olson is the former director of the Portland Cable Office and was an architect for Portland's fight for an open internet in the 1990s. He will be in conversation with Senator Ron Wyden. In the senator's role representing Oregon in the United States, Senator Wyden has been a longtime supporter of net neutrality. In the Senate, he is a member of the Finance Committee, the Budget Committee, the Intelligence Committee, and the Energy and Natural Resources Committee. Senator Wyden is a ranking member of the Finance Committee and the ranking Democrat on the Energy and National Resources Committee. Please join me in welcoming Senator Wyden to the stage.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And Fridays should be filibuster-free, especially in Oregon before the 4th. And I particularly want to thank the City Club for all of their wonderful work all these years, trying to ensure that in this time of 140 characters and non-debate debates and the like, the City Club continues to talk about real issues and those policy matters that really make a difference. I also, in beginning, want to thank David Olson. He was there on an open internet before it was cool. Let's give him a big round of applause. Because he really set us all on this, this course. And I'm going to take a moment right before we get into the question of net neutrality to mention some late-breaking technology news that I think is extremely important for Oregonians and goes right to the heart of what the City Club has long stood for. The President has now created an election commission to investigate his claim of massive voter fraud, a claim, as you know, which has not been backed up with specific data and evidence. The chair of this commission is Chris Kovach, who just yesterday requested a slew of voter information from every state that includes addresses, dates of birth, and the last 4 digits of everybody's Social Security number. Several states have now rejected this request. And they were simply unwilling to put their voters' personal information at risk. As you know, I serve on the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence. My older child calls it the so-called Intelligence Committee. And I can tell you, based on my work, the federal government has done an exceptionally poor job of protecting Americans' private information. In 2015, more than 20 million employee records were hacked. More than 700,000 taxpayer accounts were breached in 2015. That is more than the number of people who live in our wonderful city. So today, I am calling on Dennis Richardson, our Secretary of State, not to endanger Oregonians' personal information and not comply with this particular request that I've outlined. Much as what David Olson did in the 90s when he talked to us about why it was important to take a stand in favor of a free and open internet. I wanted to make this announcement before all of you because it certainly will be debated frequently in the hours ahead, and I think this is another time when Oregonians ought to take a stand, and we need our Secretary of State to do it. Now, let us try to unpack for a few moments net neutrality and why it's important. And people come up to me, and Fred Meyer, one of my claims to fame is I have had a barbecued chicken in every Fred Meyer in Oregon. And a while back, somebody came up to me and said, I know you're for this neutrality thing. I don't know what it is, but I'm glad you're doing it. So let's try to unpack the mysticism of what net neutrality is right at the outset. And you may have seen Al Franken and Ed Markey and I made a video, and that was what they asked me to do at first, because they said, you've been working on these issues since your days with the senior citizens. Net neutrality basically says after you pay your internet access fee, you get to go where you want, when you want, how you want. That is the essence of the internet, its openness, its egalitarian essence, and that's what we want to keep. So all this stuff about people trying to change stuff and regulate stuff and the like, our interest is keeping what we have today because it is of enormous benefit to Americans and Oregonians. And my view is net neutrality benefits everybody in America every time each of us goes on the net. It is the principal foundational tool that has been the spark behind so much innovation and so much commerce on the net. And for me, the bottom line is we cannot let any powerful special interests extinguish that spark. That is my bottom line. So before David and I kind of wonk out here, I want to just set up the discussion with respect to a bit more about the net's framework and success. What the net has done, and the principle of net neutrality, is to make sure that every kid in America, not just the kids of the fortunate few, but every child in America enjoys equal opportunity to conduct research for their classes. It means that all job seekers have equal access to employment opportunities on the web. It means that the small startup can become the next YouTube, Google, or Facebook. And it means that all Americans have the freedom to inform themselves and express themselves. Now, what's going on is back in Washington, D.C., the big phone and cable companies don't like this so much. They figure that if they can come up with some clever sounding words like, let's make all this voluntary. Have you heard that a little bit, net neutrality? Well, let me tell you, it would be hard to get William Peter Wyden, age 9, to voluntarily agree to eat only one dessert. You aren't going to get these huge conglomerates and monopolies to voluntarily support net neutrality. So what they're doing is they're scheming to get Trump's Federal Communications Commission, that's the FCC, a new head, Mr. Pai, to allow them to create toll lanes that allow those with deep pockets to get special treatment on the net. Now, this flies directly in the face of what we believe is a public good. It basically turns on its head the principle that everybody in America ought to have an equal chance to get ahead. So you've got Mr. Pai and the President's Federal Communications Commission in the first stage of trying to roll back net neutrality protections. So it's really important to make your voice heard. And I know a lot of people say, well, look at the votes on the FCC. Let me tell you something. Some of you may have heard of PIPA and SOPA. Who's heard of PIPA and SOPA? Raise your hand. All right. These were these anti-internet bills a few years ago. All the powerful special interests said, we're against piracy. I'm against piracy. But they said we really got to unravel the architecture of the internet, the domain name system, in order to fight piracy. And I said, not so fast. That's going to be really good for the big money people. And they're trying to make sure people don't sell fake Viagra or whatever it is they're selling. But it's not going to be good for the typical person. But the powerful interests went out and got 44 United States senators to co-sponsor this bill that would basically alter the architecture of the internet to fight piracy. And I put a hold on it. Big hold, right like this. Senators allowed to do that. At the time I did it, 44 United States senators were on the other side. 44. That was like an army. There were only 100 of us. And everybody said, well, Ron's got this hold on it, and we all like Ron. And he's from Oregon. You know, like, this is a Portlandia show or something. And they said, you know, all of us, the big guys, we want this. There's a lot of money for us in it, just like there would be with, you know, paid prioritization of the net. And they would ask me what I thought, and I said, I think you guys are going to be surprised when we vote, because a lot of people who believe in net neutrality and not messing with the architecture of the internet, they spend more time online in a week than they spend thinking about their senator in 2 years. And everybody goes, well, that's Ron, and you know, that's Oregon, and the like. So a vote was scheduled for Monday, and we had been working on this with advocates, many of the same people David has been with for years. And on the Wednesday before the vote, 5 days, 15 million Americans called and texted and tweeted and went to their members' events. And about 36 hours later, a not very happy Senate leadership called me and said, you won. We're not going to unravel the internet this way. And when the City Club told me about this program and the FCC beginning this process of trying to unravel net neutrality, I said, thank you once again, City Club, for getting the timing right. Because this is the time when we mobilize the grassroots. And by the way, anybody who doubts the power of the grassroots, if it hadn't been for millions of Americans in the last 2 weeks calling, texting, writing, going to see their member of Congress, my view is, because we're at Friday afternoon, the United States Senate would have passed a horrible health care bill to unravel the Affordable Care Act. The House would have stayed in session Friday and Saturday. They would have passed the horrible Senate bill, and the President would have signed it either Sunday or Monday. It didn't happen because there was all this grassroots involvement. So whether it's PIPA and SOPA, whether it is a bad Senate health bill, and by the way, we are a long way from being out of the woods on health care. You all may want to ask about it, because you can be sure that it's going to be another tough fight. Mitch McConnell has a $200 billion slush fund that he can use to round up the additional votes. But I'm telling you, citizen pressure really matters. And we have to have that now in the fight for net neutrality. And let me tell you, I don't see how Oregon's commitment to startups, not just small businesses, to startups, can continue to flourish without a free and open internet and net neutrality. I mean, this is what puts the startup on a level playing field with the big guys, with the powerful, people. And Oregon has always been about startups and that person who's got a dream. And the same principle, by the way, that applies to startups also applies to speech, free speech, and organizing. Net neutrality protects free speech online by making sure companies can't prefer one type of content over another, including political content. And it gives a level playing field to all of you community organizers in the room. And there are a lot of people getting more engaged in government than ever. And net neutrality gives them a chance to do it. They don't have to have a political action committee. They don't have to have a deep pocket. Net neutrality gives them the chance to do it. I'm the senior Democrat on the Senate Finance Committee, so I think a lot about how those startups are going to compete in a global marketplace. Net neutrality is an integral part of digital trade, an area important for red, white, and blue jobs. So you need strong net neutrality rules in place so we can push other countries to make sure that they don't discriminate against those small Oregon firms that want to do business overseas. So I'm going to come back to one last point. I've tried to highlight what I think has really been the essence of Oregon, which is making sure that people with a good idea and energy and a sense of what I call the Oregon way. It's not necessarily Democratic or Republican. It's fresh. It's innovative. And net neutrality really embodies that. It is a federal policy that embodies the Oregon way, that gives everybody a fair shake, that says just because you have power and clout doesn't mean you get to elbow everybody else aside. So we need another Oregon groundswell. I put it on my website, so you can go right to my website and get the link. We need another groundswell of Americans speaking out and pushing back against those who would pull the plug on net neutrality. I've tried to give you some examples where your voices and the voices of your neighbors have made a difference in the past. Now we need for all of you to show Donald Trump's Federal Communications Commission and those in the Congress who agree with them that our people and Oregonians, we are not going to take an assault on the open internet lying down. Somebody told me the other day they didn't want to see the cableization of the internet. I'll put it my way. Let's make sure Oregon tells the big cable companies the internet is not for sale. Thanks for having me.
For those of you listening on Oregon Public Broadcasting, this is City Club of Portland's Friday Forum. I'm David Olson here in conversation with Senator Ron Wyden, and we are discussing net neutrality. And Senator Wyden, we so appreciate what you've done on this issue. You've been there from the beginning. You have been on this issue from here to here. In fact, I am wondering if...
David, save the internet. Thank you.
I am wondering, if anybody under 30 remembers this. Wait for it. Does anyone under 30 know what that is? Okay. Senator, the chair of the FCC says, oh my gosh, you can't regulate the internet like a telephone, like a common carrier. It would be the death of the internet. How could you possibly do that? Many of us know the internet was birthed on the telephone as a common carrier. And those rules require what? That people be treated fairly, that everybody be served, and that no one can be shut out because it's a necessity. What's happened to the FCC? Why does no one remember this?
Well, David is being logical, and heaven forbid that logic should take over. First couple of points. One, this notion that the policies, and by the way, this is the different FCC. In 2015, the court upheld it in 2017. We were told by a number of these powerful lobbies that this would discourage investment. Oh my goodness, we weren't going to see private sector investment in Western civilization was going to end. Has not happened. That's number one. Number two, what has happened is the Federal Communications Commission has changed hands, and there is a very different political leadership. And what is especially ominous about this, and David and I were talking about it, is the special interests that we're up against. They are going to be very clever in their communications. In other words, they've done a lot of polling. And if you ask people about net neutrality, people say they're for it. They say, yeah, we ought to have that. So what they're going to kind of roll out, and it's begun already, is this notion that we ought to have voluntary net neutrality. And I already made the comparison between Comcast, Verizon, and my 9-year-old. But let me tell you about the history, because the history is what is important apropos of David's point. These big internet service providers have a long history of abusing net neutrality principles. Verizon sued the Federal Communications Commission when it previously passed the Open Internet Order that put the net neutrality rules on the books. They don't want real net neutrality. They want something that they could use to squash their competition, to change the way we all get fair access to content, and they're going to wrap it up in this poll-tested lingo of how they are for voluntary net neutrality when they really want something different, which I sometimes say is the only question in life is how do I get an itty-bitty unfair advantage?
Indeed. Senator Wyden, 12 years ago, someone we all know said, "This is a wonderful illustration of how an experienced agency can turn statutory constraints into bureaucratic discretions and by reserving the right to change the facts. This is not only bizarre, it's probably unconstitutional. There is nothing to fear from common carrier regulation of ISPs." That's a quote from Justice Antonin Scalia.
Noted left-winger.
And the question arises, what have we done? There are 75% of Americans have one choice for their high-speed data. 5 companies account for 80% of the broadband subscriptions. And the FCC now says, you know, let's take out the notion that this is a utility everybody has to have. Really, these 5 companies have our best interests at heart, and we're all going to be fine. What do you think of that?
What has happened is that these companies have walked away from what they preached to the American people for years and years. They were always preaching competition and marketplace forces. But what we've had is not competition and marketplace forces. We have had this unprecedented spree towards media consolidation. And the big mergers, it's these big mergers that are doing the harm to consumers that David just described. You want to harm consumers? You want to restrict consumer choice? Then just give a green light to all these big monopolies and big mergers and Time Warner and all the mergers that we're looking at down the road. That's what has really changed here, David. The language that the big companies preached for years and years about the benefit of markets and competition, when it really got down to it, what they were looking for were mergers and consolidations and approaches that would give them more leverage by restricting choices consumers had.
Senator, what's wrong with internet fast lanes if consumers are willing to pay for them? What's wrong with that idea?
Well, what happens if you have internet fast lanes, and this is also lingo for what's called paid prioritization, because again, they've tested all the words and people kind of say, fast lanes, I don't want anybody to have fast lane over me. Paid prioritization, again, sounds a little more antiseptic. What it does is it harms everybody who doesn't have the good fortune of a deep pocket. The small internet startup ought to be able to put their product on browsers or their apps on smartphones and have no additional financial barriers to do so. This is the free and open internet. And I think the point is, we have always said that we're interested in approaches that give us the opportunity to build out more broadband. That makes sense. But we are not going to sit by and change the egalitarian feature that underlines the internet, which we think is going to create the most opportunities for all Americans to get ahead, and you will lose those with paid prioritization, where certainly some content is going to be preferred over other.
Absolutely. And so many of us are carrying these around. 911 calls go to these. So many of us have these and are carrying them around. And that means our business transactions, our emails, our personal data So many of us have personal data going onto those phones and going onto the web. If we're all keeping...
Can I just interrupt on that?
Please.
Because
Yeah.
there was one colossally bad decision that hasn't gotten a lot of attention.
Yeah.
Because over the last 5 months, there have been a lot of bad decisions, but one got missed. And that is the Congress, over my very strong opposition, really stepped back from all the principles we're talking about and gave the ISPs the ability to sell people's browsing history to advertisers. And I don't think most Americans, knew about this, but browsing history is just about the most intimate information that's out there. I have been able to hold off the intelligence establishment from having the FBI issue administrative orders, not even go to court, just administrative orders to get people's browsing history. And one of the reasons I was successful is I told senators, I don't think you guys are going to want your browsing history out and about. But it very much relates to the power of the ISPs that David just touched on, that we had this horrendous decision that sort of vanished under the radar. But the idea that your big internet service provider with minimal kind of consumer protection, I guess on page 78 they tell you what's going on in the small print, can sell your most intimate information to advertisers, your browsing history, is an indication of the power of these firms David's talking about.
We wondered in the 1990s here in Portland, the struggle we had here led to the coining of the term net neutrality and the first discussion of it. In fact, our cases are on page 1 of the Law Review article inventing the term. But we wondered then and we wonder now, why are people in the United States paying more for slower speeds than many other developed countries in the world have? Why is that?
I think that there are a variety of reasons, for this. I mean, when you think about the essence of this, and particularly this question of citizens paying more and would voluntary approaches somehow, take care of it. Even if the big cable people followed so-called voluntary net neutrality, I don't think it's going to do a whole lot for lowering prices or increasing speeds. What the companies are most likely to do, based on their history, is build in loopholes and extra fees, and then your prices, go up because you don't have any strong protections that would push back against that happening. So you come back again to this question of how do we actually move forward? And to me, this calls for a full dose of real competition. In other words, not just letting the companies kind of slither out after they claimed they were for competition and then they wanted paid prioritization lanes and voluntary net neutrality and all the things that they're pushing for, but we really held them to a standard of having to compete. That's how we get the best deal going down the road.
For those of you listening on Oregon Public Broadcasting, this is City Club of Portland's Friday Forum. I'm David Olson, here in conversation with Senator Ron Wyden about net neutrality. Senator Wyden, if you'll forgive me, I want to tell you a story. In 1977, I was on the staff of the Oregon State Senate Human Resources Committee, and we were at a hearing about a bill to protect seniors. And I looked in the back of the room and I said, Who's the guy in the back of the room with his legs over 3 rows of chairs? And the administrator said, that's Ron Wyden with the Gray Panthers. I said, I've heard of him. And I just want to say, you've been fighting for seniors. You've been fighting for everybody in the state for so many years. And some of us remember those days, even way back when. Thank you.
If if I can just say one thing on that, because my parents fled the Nazis in the 30s. Not all got out. We lost family at Theresienstadt and Kristallnacht. And if my grandparents were here today, they couldn't even imagine that their first generation grandson had had these kinds of opportunities. And I will tell you, I think that a big part of what they'd say is, you sure went to the right place. I went to school on a basketball scholarship. I was dreaming of playing in the NBA. Ridiculous idea. I was too small, and I made up for it by being really slow. But I got to come to Oregon, and I fell in love with it. I said, I am not leaving this great place where there is so much happening, whether it was in politics with communications and the elderly and startups and culture and all the things that we're so proud of. And because it's getting ready to be summer and the family will be here for most of the month, it makes you reflect a little bit, as you wouldn't always when you're chasing another amendment to the amendment to the amendment in Washington, D.C., particularly when you're dealing with things like voting requests that ask for your personal data and rolling back net neutrality and trying to protect people's browsing history. I just want to say thank you to all of you and the people of Oregon for giving me a chance to represent the very best place on earth in the United States Senate. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Senator. Also, on behalf of the World Affairs Council and the City Club, you know, there was a strong effort made to get a pro-speaker on the current FCC initiative. Senator, it's very difficult to do that. And in fact, another anecdote, you may recall when you were in the House of Representatives, you very presciently held a small subcommittee hearing on infomercials that were cluttering broadcast airwaves to the expense of the public interest. You and your staff person, Steve Jennings, tried desperately to get somebody from the broadcast industry to come and talk about the importance of infomercials. You couldn't do it. Is there any relationship between vested interests and their unwillingness to address some of these issues?
You think? I don't think it's fair to have a political program without saying that Citizens United, this abomination of a Supreme Court case, is already corroding so much of the political debate, because what we've seen is this court is really saying that the rich person's checkbook and the poor person's soapbox are the same thing. And that is just flat out bizarre, because we know that the rich person's checkbook buys so much more content. So this week in Oregon, in my effort to make a small contribution to fighting Citizens United, I'm going to have 8 more town hall meetings. This will get us up to, I think, 834 during my time representing Oregon in the United States Senate. And those town meetings where we don't give any speeches, we just ask questions, seems to me to be very much in the same vein as the City Club, is trying to make sure that you have real discussions of issues that matter to people, and you don't have to make a big donation to some political, dinner and show up, as one person said at one of my town meetings, said, Ron, I'm really looking forward to this meeting. Do I have to wear a tux with a crumb bun on it? And I said, nope, we're throwing open the doors of government. Nobody's got to have a tux with a cummerbund either. So I think David's point about how this is played out in politics is not happening by accident. You can trace it directly to the breadcrumbs laid by the Citizens United Supreme Court case.
On that, on a financial note, this is our last question, then we're going to go to questions from the House. Your colleague, Senator Cruz, described net neutrality as Obamacare for the internet and said everyone's just going to tax it anyway. We're all going to tax the heck out of it, federal, state, and local. Have you not been involved in making sure that did not happen?
Well, first of all, I heard something along the lines of Senator Cruz saying this. That's like saying a senator's father was involved in JFK's assassination. So I'm going to have to spend some more time thinking about that.
Shall we go to the audience for questions? Again, for those of you listening on OPB, this is City Club of Portland's Friday Forum. I am David Olson, having the great honor to be here in conversation with Senator Ron Wyden. We're discussing net neutrality. We're now going to go to the audience for questions. If you have written a question on an index card, please hold it high for staff to collect. You can also submit questions through Twitter using the hashtag #FridayForum. I'll try and read at least one index card question and one from our other sources. We also invite City Club members to ask their questions at the microphone, which is near at hand. Asking questions at the Friday Forum microphone is a benefit of City Club membership. Membership is open to everyone.
David, can they ask questions about health care too? Because as I came in, a bunch of people were asking about that. Is that legal?
Senator, if you're sitting in that chair holding a microphone, it's legal.
That sounds cool.
So, may we, the question circulated to me or from a mic?
Right here.
Thank you. There we are.
Thank you for being here today, Senator Wyden. Mike Mahalik, City Club member. Real simple question. You mentioned Internet Fast Lane, and I think you or our host here might explain that Internet Fast Lane is not the same as how much you pay for your internet speed at home. As you showed in your demonstration, some people might be accessing the internet with a modem because that's all that's available. They might have cable, they might have Fios or whatever. But the thing is I can pay for various different internet speeds, but that's not the same thing as Internet Fast Lane. Thank you. The question is, could you please clarify what Internet Fast Lane means versus speed of the internet?
Do you want to do that, Dave?
Sure. An Internet Fast Lane would be paid for by providers such as Netflix or NFL or sports, those folks who want to make sure they have a fast lane to your house for popular programming. They have the money to back it up. Problem with it is that true of the school teacher where your kids are? Is that going to be true of your doctor's office? Is that going to be true of the local governments where you get services? The answer is no, it's not. And the HOV lanes on the internet are going to go to those who pay for them. Others are going to be left behind. There's a digital divide in this country.
That's the key point, is once you do this, you are on your way to cultivating what I call an information aristocracy. Yeah. You've got these people who are going to be able to get this special lane. They're going to be blazing ahead, and that is going to make it harder for that startup, that person just getting out of the gate in their garage, and you are on your way to a two-tiered system of communications as opposed to building on what we've been talking about, what David began in the 90s. And I mean, look, there have been a couple of key times. I mean, David began this in the 1990s. I began this in the Senate in the right after Ted Stevens, then the chairman of the Senate Commerce Committee, said the internet was a series of tubes. and I said, I'm going to introduce the first Senate net neutrality bill. I think it was about 2005. And so there have been kind of sort of inflection points in this debate. And what I think your issue touches on is whether or not we're going to have an information aristocracy.
Senator Wyden, thank you for being here. Chris McCants, City Club member. I'm really proud of the representation that you're bringing to DC on our behalf. One thing I wanted to ask, over the past few months, I've learned a lot more than I ever knew about the reconciliation process, but everything about the FCC I've learned from John Oliver. So if you could just give us a quick sense of, if we want to call people, if we want to try and stop this, what is the process and where are those pressure points?
Are you talking about net neutrality or the
yes,
health bill?
Net neutrality now, the FCC.
Yeah, we have put a link on our website so that we walk people all the way through it. I think that we're going to be moving here in the next few weeks to a sort of steady diet of events. We're looking at a day of action that might be July 12th, which would almost be a kind of PIPA, SOPA-like day. I mean, the details are still being worked out in terms of the advocacy organizations. But you go to our website, you'll get it. I made a video just a couple of days ago with Senator Franken, Senator Markey, myself, where we all kind of laid out what this is all about. Senator Franken, in his inimitable way, began by saying, "This is insane." And then he closed it up by trying to explain in English Ed Markey's Massachusetts dialect, because he was afraid that people wouldn't understand what an ordinary consumer was. So if you go to our website, you'll get it.
Question from the cards. One of the still emerging narratives from the 2016 election is the role that the distribution of fake information, hypertags, played in fomenting distrust on Facebook and Twitter. What role can Congress play in ensuring that the information people access via the internet isn't sponsored by dark money organizations? How can we hold accountable the tech companies and the super PAC advertisers that benefit from these systems?
Well, the first thing, I think we ought to recognize that there is a fair amount of ground that doesn't violate the First Amendment that can continue to blow the whistle on this. Now, we are having some difficulty even getting the people at Homeland Security to tell us what states got hacked in the 2016 election. So the bent of national security officials is always in favor of not bringing people into the debate. And to give you an idea how this played out, I spent much of my fall trying to get President Obama to declassify more information about what we were dealing with the Russians, and he wouldn't do it. And I think that was a mistake, and I think it was something that, looking back, a lot more people are going to regret. James Comey came to the Intelligence Committee for an open hearing, and I asked him, because there was a real question about whether we were even going to get Russia into the Russian-Trump relationship into this investigation. I said, well, Mr. Comey, there are all these national articles that have already been written, and I'd like to know whether you're following up and looking into this. And he goes, well, we couldn't possibly talk about an investigation. And everybody rolled their eyes because they remembered he had a whole lot to say about investigations 12 days before the presidential election. So we are going to have to do a lot more pushing back against people who try to classify a lot of this information that speaks to your question of national security information. We have to give agencies like the Homeland Security departments direct requirements with respect to making more of this information available, because right now they are just making their default position, we're not talking.
Thanks, Senator. Question from the floor.
Chris Smith, City Club member. Senator, my day job is running the web servers for a Fortune 500 company. I'd love to have my employer participate in the day of action on July 12th, but I suspect their instinctive posture is to keep their heads down for a controversial issue like this. Do you have any thoughts I could pass on to my senior management about, one, why they should care about this, and two, why they should be vocal?
They ought to care about it, because if they're a big company, right at the heart of their, I think, company ethos, at least what's stated, is that they want to have more startups and more innovators as part of what they will do so that they can grow, and to bring those people into various kinds of projects and financial profit-generating operations. And Fortune 500 companies ought to say to themselves, not everybody gets to be a Fortune 500 company on the first day, but they ought to start working with small people who will, and to cultivate the relationships with those small companies that will be good for the Fortune 500.
Thank you. Senator, there's been a revolving door at the FCC where FCC members leave for industry almost with barely weeks between their tenure. In this case, we have a former Verizon attorney running the FCC. And that can be potentially lethal depending on your perspective. Should there be anything done about that? And, or would the FCC be better off with one of the Trump kids' wedding planners? That came from left field. I'm sorry.
Let me state the obvious. The rules with these agencies have really lost any sense, particularly when you give examples like this, of being able to give the public confidence that it will be their interest rather than, well, you said Verizon or somebody else. And what has been so frustrating about the last 6 months is a lot of this tone is really set at the top. The President of the United States is the first president in 4 decades to not release his tax returns, okay? Every Democrat, every Republican has always said this is the lowest ethical bar. So David asks about an ethical standard that's, frankly, I think a little more nuanced, because I think that there have to be really bright lines between whether you can take your previous work to a government, agency. And not only do we not have bright lines at the top of this administration, but with respect to tax returns, with respect to the emoluments clause, with respect to copyrights, the ethical problems here start at the top, and we're going to get to the bottom of them.
Thanks. Thank you, Senator. Question from the floor.
Thank you. Anthony Petchel, City Club member, and appreciate your leadership. I'll ask both a healthcare and a net neutrality question. Both the healthcare bill has historically a low approval rating, and the net neutrality has a high, approval rating for polls. Yet our GOP-controlled Congress is moving bills forward that are against what their constituents are for. And they're also just not even going and having town halls like what you're doing. So in an age of Citizen United, how do we combat that change in DC where they're moving against the public's best interest?
The way you do it is to keep, as I've tried to mention the last few weeks on the health bill, showing that at some point you create enough of a groundswell where you break through. I mean, the Republicans, they were getting hit by all sides. There were those who understood that Medicaid expansion is a lifeline for older people who need long-term care, and advocates for special needs kids and the disabled. Small businesses, there actually were some changes in their small business provisions that would actually make it harder to use an exchange in a way that would translate into lower costs and lower premiums for small business. So what you're trying to do, and that's why I went through the PIPA-SOPA history and the healthcare history of the last couple of weeks, is you're trying to create a citizens' juggernaut, a citizens' tidal wave, so that politicians can't look the other way. And particularly on net neutrality, it's not by osmosis that you don't have an espoused anti-net neutrality speaker here today. Nobody wants to stand up and make it look like, hi, I'm here today to stack the internet deck against small startups. But if they think that they can sort of soft soap everybody through, well, it's just going to be voluntary, and we've never had any voluntary problems, you have a chance of getting through. But I also reflect kind of a judgment that I made, a long time ago, is that money and power and influence and technology certainly gives people a big leg up. But we didn't win this last week on health care because we had as much money and influence as the other side. Mitch McConnell had enormous resources. We won because the people's voice outweighed the special interests. We won on PIPA and SOPA because all those millions of people took on the movie studios and the Chamber of Commerce and all those far-right organizations. And by the way, I wouldn't be in the United States Congress had it not been for a grassroots movement, because when I ran the first time, everybody said, who's that skinny kid with the Gray Panthers? And I got to Congress because of citizens' power. So sign me up for always picking you against the special interests.
We're out of broadcast time and we'll have to stop for the day. If this program has inspired you to join and you're not a member yet, or to contribute to the City Club, you can still do so at the registration table as you leave the hotel today, or on the web. This is Leslie Johnson for the City Club's Board of Governors. Please join me in a warm thank you to our guests, Senator Ron Wyden and David Olson, and our partners at the World Affairs Council.